I stood there in the middle of a world I had never truly belonged to. My name is Alex Miller, 28 years old, a regular warehouse worker from California, and today was supposed to be my wedding day. This five-star hotel was so dazzling it left me breathless. Crystal chandeliers sparkled like thousands of fallen stars hanging from the ceiling, casting light over 500 guests, business tycoons, politicians, and the elite of high society. They laughed and chatted loudly, clinking champagne glasses, discussing stocks, yachts, and vacations in Europe. I was wearing a custom-tailored tuxedo, forcing a smile onto my face, but inside I was a bundle of nerves. This was my wedding to Lacey Ellington, daughter of one of the wealthiest families around, and I knew full well that I was just an ordinary guy who had somehow slipped into their world. My heart pounded as I scanned the crowd, searching for a familiar face among this sea of strangers. And then I saw him, my father, Benson Miller, 61 years old, walking in through a side door. He was wearing the same old suit I remembered him buying more than 10 years ago. His worn leather shoes were cracked and scuffed. His thin frame slightly stooped as if trying to make himself smaller. He stood quietly in a far corner, near the emergency exit, like he was afraid of disturbing anyone. His face was weathered from years of hard labor, but his eyes shone with a mixture of pride and anxiety. My dad had raised me single-handedly after Mom passed away. He had worked himself to the bone on our little farm so I could get a decent education. He never complained once, but today, in the middle of all this luxury, he looked heartbreakingly out of place. My throat tightened, dry and aching. A wave of love and pain washed over me. I wanted to run to him right then and pull him into a proper seat in the family section.
"Dad, why are you standing there all alone?"
I thought, my heart twisting. He had sacrificed so much for me. He deserved respect. But before I could move, people started noticing. Whispers rippled through the crowd like an undercurrent. A group of women in glittering evening gowns turned to look, smirking. "Who's that? Looks like he just walked off a farm." One whispered loud enough for me to hear. Fingers pointed. Eyes judged him like he was some strange object that had wandered into their elite party. I felt the blood rush to my face, burning hot. They were mocking my father, the man who taught me how to be decent. My future father-in-law, Brantley Ellington, chairman of the massive Ellington Group empire, stood not far away. He glanced at my dad with open disdain as if looking at an insect, then turned away, shaking his head in annoyance, going back to chatting with the senator as if nothing had happened. I clenched my fists, fighting the anger rising inside me. Brantley had never approved of this marriage. He always saw me as beneath him, only fit to run errands. My future mother-in-law, Elise Ellington, 54, stood among her circle of diamond necklace-wearing socialites. She gave a thin, condescending smile and said in her shrill voice, "My future in-laws are a little too modest, aren't they? I wonder if he's comfortable in a place like this." The group burst into sharp, cutting laughter that stabbed straight into my heart. Elise always pretended to be polite, but I knew exactly what she thought of my family. Low-class people who didn't belong in the Ellington bloodline. My chest tightened with anger and humiliation on my father's behalf. I started toward him, determined to bring him to the family area, but Lacey grabbed my arm hard. "Stop it right now," she hissed. "Just let your dad stand there. Don't make a scene. Today is supposed to be our day." I looked at her, stunning in her white wedding dress, but her eyes were cold, not a trace of empathy. I had loved Lacey for her strength, for the moments we shared joy and hardship, back when we were just college students, but now she seemed completely changed, fully absorbed into her family's world. From across the room, my dad caught my eye and gave a small shake of his head, sad but resigned. It was like he was saying, "It's okay, son. Don't make a fuss because of me." He forced a weak smile, trying to hide his pain. My throat closed up. Tears threatened to spill. My father had endured so much, and now he was still swallowing his pride for me. The ceremony continued in the grand hall. When it was time for the big family photos, I insisted on bringing my dad up on stage. "Dad, come stand with me," I said, my voice trembling slightly but firm, determined not to let him be invisible any longer. Before I continue, tell, from which place are you watching this story right now? Please subscribe and like the video for motivation. My dad hesitated for a moment, glancing at the crowd as if weighing whether he had the right to step into their world. The whispers grew louder, and I could see the thin line of judgment cutting across the faces of Lacey's family and their guests. Brantley Ellington's eyes narrowed, a silent warning that he considered this move inappropriate, almost insulting. Elise's lips pressed into a tight line, and her friends tilted their heads, murmuring behind gloved hands. But I held out my hand again, steady this time, and he slowly took it, letting me lead him toward the stage. Every step he took seemed measured, careful, as if he feared shattering the fragile world of crystal chandeliers and silk dresses around him. My heart ached seeing him so vulnerable, yet there was a quiet dignity in the way he carried himself. He didn't speak, didn't flinch at the stares or the laughter that bubbled like a current beneath the polite chatter. When we reached the center of the stage, I stood next to him, my hand resting lightly on his shoulder. He looked around, taking in the grandeur, and for a fleeting second I thought I saw a shadow of pride flicker in his eyes. I could feel the tension in the room shift, subtle but undeniable, like the moment right before a storm breaks. Cameras clicked, flashes went off, and I sensed the polite smirks beginning to falter, just slightly, at the sheer presence of this man who had nothing to prove but everything to show. Lacey stayed back, her face carefully composed, but her eyes betraying the slightest flicker of annoyance. She whispered something under her breath to Brantley, who chuckled dismissively, thinking we didn't notice. I wanted to tell her to stay quiet, to let my dad have this small moment of respect, but the words caught in my throat. My father stood taller than I had ever seen him, his thin shoulders square, his eyes calm and steady. No longer the man trying to shrink, he seemed almost magnetic, drawing the attention of everyone in the room. And then it happened. A guest, a wealthy socialite I didn't recognize, leaned over to another and said something that made them both pause and look again, not with ridicule but with curiosity, even a hint of awe. I caught my dad's eyes and saw a tiny knowing smile, the kind that spoke of quiet strength and secrets kept for decades. My heart surged. The whispers, the judgment, the mocking, they began to feel smaller, almost insignificant compared to the presence of the man who had raised me, who had sacrificed everything for me. I felt a rush of pride so sharp it left me breathless. Lacey's face tightened, and I realized in that moment that the game had shifted. What the room hadn't expected, the true weight of my father's life, his resilience, his achievements hidden beneath the plain suit and worn shoes, was starting to ripple through the crowd, subtly but powerfully. I squeezed my dad's shoulder gently, and he gave me a small nod, the kind that said, "I've got you, son, always." For the first time that night, I felt like we weren't just two ordinary people in a world that didn't belong to us. We were unshakable, even if no one else could see it yet. The ceremony continued, but my eyes never left my father. Every so often, I caught the subtle looks of disbelief spreading through the crowd. It was as if they were starting to realize that the man they had quietly mocked was not just some ordinary farmer, not just a simple man in an old suit. My father's calm demeanor carried a quiet authority, and people instinctively gave him space. Even Brantley Ellington seemed unsettled, his practiced smirk faltering as he observed the growing curiosity in the room. Elise whispered urgently to her friends, her tone sharper than before, as if trying to control the ripple that threatened to expose their misjudgment. I felt a flicker of satisfaction. Finally, some recognition of the dignity my father had carried all his life, uncelebrated but unbroken. When it came time for the speeches, I watched in awe as Dad stood slightly behind me, just off to the side. Guests cleared their throats nervously, suddenly aware of his presence. I could sense the shift in the air. The same people who had whispered about worn shoes and tattered cuffs now paused, almost afraid to speak, as if the room itself acknowledged him. My heart pounded, a mix of relief and pride. Lacey clutched my arm briefly, a gesture of uncertainty rather than affection. I realized then that the day had changed, not just for me but for everyone here. My father's quiet strength had begun to challenge the entire hierarchy of this gathering. Then came the moment that would truly start to turn the tide. One of the Ellington socialites, a sharp-eyed woman with a diamond bracelet that glittered like tiny suns, leaned closer to Brantley and murmured something. Brantley's jaw tightened, and I saw the flash of recognition in his eyes. My pulse quickened. The whispers had shifted, the tone changing from ridicule to cautious respect, tinged with confusion. My father, still standing humbly, gave me a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was like he was saying, "Watch and wait, son. This isn't over yet." The ceremony ended, the applause ringing through the hall, but I could see the subtle cracks forming in the facade of superiority around me. People were talking quietly, casting sidelong glances at my dad, trying to make sense of what they had missed. Lacey's hand slipped from mine, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and astonishment. For the first time, she seemed to realize that the man she had considered beneath us, the man she had silently dismissed, carried a weight far beyond what any of these people could measure. I felt a surge of vindication swell in my chest, tempered by a deep, burning love for my father. Every whisper, every sneer, every glance of judgment had only highlighted the truth. My father's worth could never be measured by the clothes he wore or the simplicity of his life, and now everyone in that room was starting to sense it. After the ceremony, the reception began, and the room seemed even grander now, if that was possible. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead, casting 1,000 tiny reflections across polished marble floors and gleaming tables. Waiters in crisp white jackets glided between guests, carrying trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres. Lacey's family seemed poised to display the perfection they had built their lives around, the kind of control that could make anyone feel small. But my eyes kept returning to my father. He remained at the edge of the room, quiet, observing, yet fully aware of every sideways glance, every whispered insult, every condescending smile. I wanted to move him to the head table, to give him the respect he deserved. But I hesitated, sensing that this moment, awkward and tense as it was, held something far more powerful. Guests began to notice him more and more, the way he carried himself, the calm in his posture, the faint glimmer of intelligence in his eyes. It was subtle, barely perceptible, but for those attuned to such things, it was magnetic. The laughter that had once punctured my heart now seemed to falter, replaced with curiosity. Brantley Ellington, my future father-in-law, kept glancing toward him, his face tightening, his usual smug confidence giving way to a flicker of concern. Elise tried to whisper reassurances to her friends, but the words lacked conviction. It was as if the very presence of my father was beginning to unsettle their carefully constructed social hierarchy. Lacey floated through the crowd, her dress flowing like liquid silk, but her smiles were forced, her eyes darting anxiously to see what others were noticing. I could feel the tension building, the almost electric awareness that something unexpected was happening, something that no one could quite define. I finally approached my dad, taking his hand and guiding him gently toward a quieter corner where we could talk without prying eyes. His eyes met mine, and I could see a spark there, a quiet pride tempered by humility. "Alex," he whispered, his voice steady, "don't worry. Just let them watch. They'll see what they need to see." I felt a shiver of awe. Every sacrifice he had made, every hard day on the farm, every time he had swallowed his pride so I could have a better life, it was all contained in that small, confident smile. I knew then that whatever came next, he was ready. And indeed, what came next began almost imperceptibly. A conversation at a nearby table caught my attention. One of the older guests leaned toward another, speaking in hushed tones. I couldn't hear everything, but the words wealth, investment, and Miller floated through the air. My father's presence, it seemed, was beginning to command attention in a way no one expected. Brantley's eyes narrowed as he listened, clearly trying to control the narrative, but the curiosity had taken root. Even Elise's circle of socialites was shifting subtly, their polite laughter faltering as whispers replaced chatter. The room had begun to recognize that there was more here than a humble man in an old suit. My heart raced as I watched, a mixture of pride and suspense washing over me. I wanted to rush to him, to tell everyone the truth, but I held back. There was a moment coming, a revelation that needed to unfold naturally. And then, as if on cue, a few people began approaching him, asking questions, shaking his hand. His voice, calm and assured, answered politely, but each answer seemed to carry weight, authority, and knowledge that left listeners momentarily stunned. Lacey's expression had changed from annoyance to something else. Entirely. Bewilderment, perhaps even fear. The room had started to notice that the man they had dismissed, mocked and ignored, held a quiet power that could not be denied. I felt a surge of vindication and admiration, a mix so powerful I could barely stand still. My father had endured a lifetime of hardship without complaint, and now, standing in this glittering hall, he was finally claiming the respect he had always deserved, without boasting, without showing off, simply by being himself. The whispers grew, spreading like wildfire. People leaned in, seeking to understand, to gauge, to reconcile the humility of his appearance with the authority of his words. Brantley's jaw tightened further, his eyes narrowing with a mix of anger and disbelief. Elise's hand gripped her champagne glass so tightly I thought it might shatter. Lacey's hand found mine again, trembling, and I felt her fear. But I also felt something deeper, a shift in the tide, a quiet revolution in that room where appearances had always ruled. My father stood at the edge of it all, unflinching, commanding, undeniable. And in that moment, I realized that the world they had tried to force upon me, the world of judgment, of snobbery, of assumed superiority, was crumbling, bit by bit, under the weight of a man who had nothing to prove yet everything to show. The dinner began, and the clinking of silverware and soft murmur of conversation filled the hall, but my attention was fixed entirely on my father. He had been quietly moving among the guests, answering questions with a calm authority that seemed to command respect. Without him even trying, people who had previously snickered now listened intently, their expressions shifting from amusement to curiosity, then to cautious admiration. Brantley Ellington's usually imperious demeanor was cracking. With every subtle acknowledgement my father received, Elise, sensing the change, leaned toward him, whispering in frustration, but the smile she forced could not hide her unease. I stayed close to my dad, my heart pounding with a mixture of pride and amazement. Each time someone paused to shake his hand, to ask a question, to seek advice, I felt a rush of vindication so sharp it left me breathless. My father, always the silent pillar of strength in my life, was finally being seen for who he truly was. Lacey hovered nearby, her eyes flicking nervously between me and my father. Her hand gripped my arm, a mixture of apprehension and disbelief, as though she could feel the shifting dynamics in the room but did not yet fully understand the extent of what was happening. The whispers became more deliberate now, spreading like ripples across a pond. People began leaning in to listen, sharing observations with one another, as if discovering a hidden gem right in the middle of the ballroom. My dad moved with quiet confidence, engaging with them politely but always with a subtle air of authority that made their earlier mockery feel foolish and small. At one point, Brantley tried to intervene, stepping forward with that commanding presence he always used to dominate a room, but my father simply smiled and answered a question from a guest before Brantley could even speak. It was a small act, almost imperceptible, but it left the Ellington patriarch momentarily speechless. My chest swelled with pride, a fierce protective love for the man who had given me everything without ever asking for recognition. I realized in that moment that this was more than vindication. It was a quiet triumph, the culmination of years of sacrifices, of hard work and unwavering integrity. Lacey's eyes widened as she watched the subtle shift in the room. Her carefully constructed facade of composure faltered, revealing glimpses of shock and fear. I could see her questioning herself, questioning her family's assumptions, and perhaps even questioning the kind of life she thought she had been born into. My father, sensing her tension but never breaking his calm, gave me a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was as if he was telling me to remain patient, to let them come to their own realizations, because the story of his life, the depth of his wisdom and experience could not be rushed. The night continued, the energy in the room charged with unspoken acknowledgement. Guests who had once glanced dismissively now lingered, hoping to catch a word from him, to understand the quiet power that radiated from a man in an unassuming suit. Even Brantley's rigid posture betrayed his discomfort, and Elise's attempts at social control grew increasingly desperate. I felt a surge of gratitude and awe toward my father. This was the man who had raised me alone, who had labored day and night to give me the life I had. And now, without pomp or grandeur, he was commanding respect that no money or title could ever buy. And in the midst of it all, I understood that the final moments of the evening, the culmination of everything, would soon reveal what I had always known. My father was more than anyone in that room could imagine. The tension had reached its peak, and the stage was set for a revelation that would change everything, for the guests, for Lacey, and for me. By the time the dessert was being served, the atmosphere in the hall had shifted completely. What had started as a room filled with polite pretension and quiet derision now hummed with curiosity, awe, and a subtle undercurrent of fear. My father, Alex's dad, remained calm, moving through the crowd with a quiet confidence that contrasted sharply with the Ellingtons' forced smiles and clipped movements. Every question he answered, every small anecdote he shared about investments, ventures, and long-term business strategies revealed glimpses of a life hidden beneath the humble exterior of worn shoes and a faded suit. The guests leaned in closer, their earlier judgment replaced with genuine fascination. Whispers turned into quiet murmurs of respect. I could see Brantley Ellington's jaw tighten again and Elise biting her lip, the hard lines of control on her face now faltering under the weight of realization. Lacey, standing beside me, seemed frozen, unsure how to process the truth that was unraveling right before her eyes. The small details, the subtle hints my father had dropped throughout the evening, the quiet way he spoke of partnerships, his precise understanding of markets, and his knowledge of influential people in multiple industries were adding up. Slowly, like pieces of a puzzle clicking into place, it became clear to anyone paying attention. The man they had mocked as a poor, humble farmer was no ordinary man at all. My chest swelled with pride mixed with a fierce protective heat. I thought of every sacrifice he had made, every long day on the farm, every moment he had worked silently so I could have opportunities he never had. And now the world was finally starting to see him as I had always known him to be. Formidable, intelligent, and unyieldingly dignified, Brantley tried one last time to assert his authority, stepping forward with a commanding presence, attempting to redirect the attention back to himself and his social circle. But my father's calm, quiet words stopped him mid-sentence. A ripple of recognition passed through the crowd. Even the most skeptical guests paused, realizing that this man's influence extended far beyond the walls of the ballroom, far beyond the power of the Ellington name. My father's eyes met mine across the hall, and he gave a slight nod, one that carried decades of wisdom, experience, and unspoken pride. It was as if he were saying, "This is your moment too. Alex, stand tall." My hands clenched at my sides. I could feel a growing courage, a boldness I had never known surging through me. Lacey's face had lost its composure entirely now. She was pale, eyes wide, and her carefully cultivated image of control shattered in an instant. Elise's shoulders stiffened as she whispered frantically to Brantley. But it was too late. The tide had shifted irrevocably. The whispers had become admiring chatter. Guests were approaching my father, asking questions, shaking his hand, seeking his advice and insight, as if discovering a hidden legend in the center of their high society gathering. I could feel the Ellingtons' power in the room crumbling, their social dominance challenged by a man they had assumed would be invisible. And in the midst of it all, I realized something profound. This was not just my father's vindication. It was the validation of everything he had instilled in me. Integrity, hard work, humility, and quiet strength. As I watched him, I knew that no wealth, no family name, no social position could ever outweigh the respect and admiration that comes from character. And my father had it in abundance. The final shift came subtly but powerfully. A few influential guests exchanged glances and murmured among themselves, clearly reassessing the Ellington empire in light of my father's presence. Brantley's face flushed with a mix of anger and disbelief, and Elise's attempts to maintain control became increasingly desperate. But it was futile. The room, once filled with mockery and judgment, now hummed with admiration, curiosity, and a growing realization that appearances had deceived them all. I stepped closer to my father, placing a hand on his shoulder, feeling the steady confidence radiate through him. "Thank you, Dad," I whispered, my voice trembling with emotion. He gave me a small smile, the kind that spoke volumes of love, sacrifice, and the unshakable knowledge that finally, the world was beginning to recognize him for the man he truly was. By the time the final speeches were being made, the air in the hall was thick with tension, anticipation, and a subtle hum of awe. My father, Alex's dad, had quietly become the center of attention without ever demanding it. Every polite nod, every handshake, every question asked of him revealed the depth of his knowledge, his influence, and his unassuming power. And then at last the moment arrived. I felt a surge of courage welling up inside me. Fueled by years of pride and gratitude, I took a deep breath and turned toward the crowd, raising my voice just enough for everyone to hear. "There's something you all should know about my father," I said, feeling my heart hammer in my chest. "The man you've been quietly mocking, judging, and underestimating. He is not just a simple farmer, or a man who worked a small farm his whole life. He is in fact a billionaire, a self-made businessman who has quietly built enterprises, invested wisely, and helped countless people along the way. Everything he has ever done, he has done with integrity, humility, and hard work, never seeking attention, never asking for recognition. And tonight, he is here not for his money, not for his status, but because he is the man who raised me, the man who gave me everything, the man who taught me what it truly means to be respectable, honorable, and strong. The room went silent, and tonight he is here, not for his money, not for his status, but because he is the man who raised me, the man who gave me everything, the man who taught me what it truly means to be respectable, honorable, and strong. The room went silent, glasses clinked mid-air, conversations froze, and even the Ellingtons were caught completely off guard. Brantley's face went pale, his usual composure replaced by shock and disbelief. Elise's lips parted in surprise, her carefully cultivated arrogance crumbling in a matter of seconds. Guests turned to look at my father, eyes wide, whispers rising like a wave as the truth spread. My dad stood there calmly, almost shyly, a faint smile on his weathered face, as if embarrassed by all the attention. But the pride in his eyes was undeniable, and I could see the subtle way the room shifted to accommodate him. Respect replacing judgment, admiration replacing mockery. Lacey, standing beside me, froze, her mouth slightly open, her eyes reflecting shock, confusion, and perhaps a dawning realization of how wrong she had been to align herself with the arrogance of her family. The whispers grew louder, some guests shaking their heads in disbelief, others leaning forward eagerly to ask my father questions, to understand how someone could have been so underestimated. Brantley attempted to regain control, stepping forward with his usual domineering posture, but the crowd no longer paid him the attention they had before. His power had evaporated under the quiet magnitude of my father's presence. Elise tried to intervene, speaking sharply, but her words were lost in the sudden murmur of curiosity and admiration for a man they had all misjudged. I looked at my father, my heart swelling, tears pricking my eyes. Every struggle, every sacrifice, every moment of quiet dignity he had carried through life had led to this, and now he stood vindicated, not by arrogance or wealth flaunted, but by the undeniable truth of who he was. I felt a surge of gratitude and love I could never fully put into words. The entire hall had been transformed. Those who had laughed now whispered apologies. Those who had judged now sought his guidance. The Ellington superiority had crumbled in the face of a quiet, unassuming power they could not ignore. And in that moment I realized something profoundly simple yet beautiful. My father had always been a giant in my life, and now the world had finally seen him too. I stepped forward, placing my hand on his shoulder, feeling the strength radiating from him. "Thank you, Dad," I whispered. He looked at me, eyes soft yet shining, and simply nodded, a smile playing at the corner of his lips. The guests began to applaud, softly at first, then louder, genuine admiration replacing polite pretense. My father raised a hand to acknowledge them, modest yet commanding, and in that instant, I felt an overwhelming sense of triumph, not just mine, but his. The man who had been underestimated, mocked and dismissed had risen, not with anger, but with quiet dignity and unwavering integrity. And I knew without a doubt that nothing would ever diminish the respect and love I had for him. That night, the world had learned a lesson my father had lived by every day. True power, true wealth, and true respect are not measured by appearances, social status, or inherited privilege. They are earned through character, resilience, and a lifetime of integrity. And as I stood there holding his hand, watching the room finally bow, not to money, not to status, but to the quiet greatness of a man who had given everything for his family, I realized that some victories are far more powerful because they are unseen until the perfect moment, when they leave the world speechless.